Hi guys, welcome back to Z's Corner. This is Dao. So for today's video, we're going to talk about firing patterns. And we're going to go from G3 epics up through the G4s. The video is going to be broken down into a few parts because it kind of gets really detailed. And it's just a topic that I don't think has been really explored by a whole lot of people before, but it does add a somewhat interesting dynamic, especially as we start looking at certain officers that can actually impact the firing patterns of your ships. And one of the reasons why I wanted to look at this is because, G3s, basically you have, two guns on the ship and they fire between 1 to 2 shots per round, depending. But for the G4s and up into the G5s, actually, the number of guns or the number of shots per gun on ships and the number of shots per round dramatically increases. So not only do the G4s have superior damage, they also have a lot more fires per round. And it kind of depends on the ship class, and there's quite a bit of variation actually between the G4 uncommons and the G4 rares, and then back up to the G4 epics. So we're gonna kind of explore this because believe it or not, this does have a little bit of impact in terms of which crews might be crucial for you, and as you get a more in-depth understanding of this, and this is gonna be later in the series. It's what it ultimately leads up to and culminates in is basically an updated station defense video. All right, so here's the quick overview of today's video. We're going to look at some of the G3 ships and their firing patterns. We're going to look at the G4 ships and their firing patterns. We're going to take a quick look at some of the officers, and for today, we're really only going to focus on the first one, which is Kuron, which is a very neat Klingon officer that they've made much more available lately for the past few months because he's been added to the Ultra Recruit chests in addition to being able to pull them from some of the G4 rare Armada chests. And then we're going to touch real quick on PvE stuff, which is the Armada crewing, and we'll have a little summary at the end. All right, so there's quite a bit of information on the spreadsheet. So what I've done is I've organized the Federation ships on the first slot. I put the Romulan ships in the second slot, and I put the Klingon ships down on the bottom. And right now, if you look at the tabs, we're looking at the G3 epics at the moment. So basically what we really want to focus on is on this side right now. We look at the firing pattern. So the rounds are on top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then these are the names of the weapons that are aboard the ship and how they fire in which round. So you can see that the Enterprise actually is interesting because it's got all energy weapons, it has no kinetic, and this is one of the reasons, by the way, why TOS Kirk, when he's in that captain role, can add significant amounts of damage to the ship because he adds damage to only energy weapons. So that's just a separate aside on this. But if you can see here on round 1, you get basically 2 shots per round, both from your phaser banks here, and then in round 2, you get 4 shots per round. And this, the bold highlight here, means this is a cycle total. So what I've done, all this info, by the way, is from STFC.space. I pulled everything on base damage because that's the best apple-to-apple type comparison. So, base damage, and we're looking at it at a tier 1. So, this is not necessarily reflective of what your Enterprise is at because it has absolutely no research, no buffs at all, territory buffs or anything like that added into these figures, but it's still a good, apple-to-apple type comparison between the different types of ships. So anyway, so what I was doing here is that I calculated damage per round, and damage per round is basically an average damage here, as you can see from this this area right here, and it is basically just an average of the min and max damage on these ships. So based on that, we have a little formula that kind of calculates what all the damage would be on a per round cycle. So you can see, so for the Enterprise, what we'll call a cycle is when everything's been fired once. And it kind of repeats. When this pattern starts repeating, it takes 2 rounds for the cycle to go over total. And at a base value, it's got about 156,000 damage. So that's pretty important. I've also pulled out another data set here called the first 3 rounds, because from my experience, a lot of the PvP fights are over relatively quickly. And it's really about actually getting your damage in as fast as you can up front. So the first 3 rounds, from my point of view at least, is going to be really important. So the USS Enterprise, you can see it does about 200,000 damage on the first 3 rounds. Of course, we give a nod to the ship ability here. So the Enterprise, again, when you have morale, it has basically Forever Shield. This is the value, 5% at tier 1. It goes up to 25% once you've maxed it. So some other things to kind of note. right here, shield health, hull health. The shield health on the Enterprise, not surprisingly, is pretty high, 230,000 at base. The hull health is actually pretty low. It's only 74,000 when it starts out at level 1, tier 1. Of course, everybody has a lot of research behind this already. So most people when they first get out their Enterprise, and you get to like level 5, I think it has close to 1 million hull damage or hull health by that point. And I introduced something called an aggregate, which is basically just these two added together. This is a little bit important to me. Of course, you can still destroy a ship without depleting its shields, obviously with the Enterprise. But still, a lot of times you have to deplete shields. It's a kind of a good aggregate measure to kind of see where the strength of the ship in total kind of stands. So this is just kind of a guide. I wouldn't say it's it's set in stone or anything, but it's kind of a guide for where you want to be. So anyway, so we look at the Enterprise. So the aggregate here between shield and hull is at a bit over 300,000. You've got a cycle total, which is not nearly as important as the first 3 rounds of 200,000 damage to begin. So, this is kind of a good basis for you to kind of understand where we're coming from. So that's the Enterprise. Let's look at the Augur. You can see, right off the bat, the Augur, it has less shield health, well, significantly more hull health. And hull in PvP is actually much more important than shields because, even while you have shield health, you're getting hull health damage. So you can be destroyed with still having shields. So definitely this is a good thing to have more of. So the Augur has plenty of hull, less so on shields. But still, overall, as you can expect from a ship of this class, because it's a battleship, it does have a little bit more in terms of aggregate than the Enterprise does, okay? The firing pattern on the Augur, you can see, and this is why in some of my other videos I really talk about not using or not really caring that much about the Obliterator because it fires every 3 rounds, and the first time it fires is in round 2. So, definitely a bigger gun, as you can see from the damage here. Right here, so average damage of 100,000. It's actually much higher than the Enterprise damages that you see up above. So a big gun, but still it doesn't fire often enough. So regardless of that, it has actually decent energy shots for the first couple of rounds, mostly because they fire more often. So you get 2 rounds per shot on the phasers. On the phaser turrets in round 1, so you get a total of 4 shots from the Augur in each single round here. So if you look at the damage per round in terms of the cycle total, which is exactly just the same as the first 3 rounds because the cycle is 3 rounds, it does about 350,000 damage. So right here you can see one of the reasons why I like the Augur so much for PvP is that it can deal a lot of damage. So whereas the Enterprise is coming out at about 203,000 the first 3 rounds, the Augur's at a bit over 350,000. Again, all level 1, tier 1 base values without any type of research or buffs in here. Again, the Obliterator is the ship ability, and it's kind of, talked about right here. So we won't go into too much about it on these G3 ships because everybody knows it pretty well. But we will give a nod to it. The only thing here to note is that on the critical hit damage bonus for the Obliterator is actually going to be a bit lower than what your typical critical hit damage bonus is for other weapons. That by default is 150%, but for the Obliterator right here, it's only 110%. And part of that is probably because it's just such a big gun. If it had 150%, critical hit damage, you could probably, it might be a little bit overpowered. So I think that's one of the reasons why they kind of tuned that down. So last but not least, the D4. Someone recently just asked me in one of my other videos, do I still think the D4 is the worst G3 epic? I do. So if you look at the data, it's kind of right here. It has little to almost, a little bit more shield health than an Augur at base, but still, 58,000, that's 9,000 more shield health. That's pitiful. More importantly, it has very little, hull health, so you can look at the aggregate value here is only 150,000. It's basically half of what the Enterprise is and half of what the Augur is. So it's a very fragile ship. So it definitely is very fragile. And does it really hit that hard? No, it doesn't based off of base values. If you look at the first 3 rounds, every single round the value is actually the same because it just fires, it alternates between the 2 kinetic weapons that it has. Right here. So 2 shots per round, 2 shots per round, 3 shots per round, 3 shots per round. And on the base values, at least, if you look at the first 3 rounds, it's only 142,000. So out of the, 3 ships we look at, not only does it have less aggregate shield and hull health, but it also has less damage in the first 3 rounds. But you're going to say, oh, it has a really good ship ability. Well, yes and no. I mean, it increases weapon damage, but it's cumulative, which is always nice, so it's stacked on top of each other. But even at a max tier D4, it's only 25% damage per round. So while that is nice to have, it just doesn't deal enough damage. And everybody's running Lorca, so Lorca crews with HE Warp, so nice. You definitely do get a very good damage multiplier from the hull breach plus critical hit, but that's kind of the danger with running that type of crew. It's counterable. If you have a TOS Rohara captain, a crew with TOS Kirk in the mix, it completely negates both HE Warp and Lorca in that mix. So while you're still getting some increased damage, while you're still getting some increased damage from the ship ability, because the hull breach is being constantly applied by Lorca anyway, it adds up too slow for you because you're still very, very weak compared to the other ships. So, that's kind of my little spiel about why I still think the D4 is the worst. And also, I think Augur and Enterprise are actually pretty much tied. I would give the favor to the Augur a little bit more, as long as you have, like a Max Marcus, which can help you take out an Enterprise pretty quickly. So anyway, a couple other things I forgot to note right here is that the critical hit damage bonus for both weapons are actually a bit lower. So they're only 125% compared to 150% in standard. However, the base critical hit chance for these weapons are actually higher, at 15% compared to what a standard weapon is at 10%. But again, the critical hit damage, while all nice and said, it is very easily counterable. That doesn't mean that the D4 isn't useful. It can be useful because you can only have one TOS or Rohara crew. It's just that, if you're only fighting one ship and they know what type of ship you have, you're going to be at a pretty significant disadvantage in that type of case. So that's kind of what the G3 ships look like, just so you get an idea. So again, not too many fires in terms of per round. So you get, between 2 to 4, sometimes 5 fires per round. That completely changes as we look into the G4 ships. So without further ado, let's kind of jump into the G4 ships. So we've got, again, the same type of template here. So we'll look at the Federation ship here first, so the Kelvin. So even at a tier 1, right off the bat, you realize that, yeah, it's got a lot more shield and hull health compared to the G3 Epics, as it should, because it's a G4. In addition, it does do more damage. Although I'll say it's not significantly more damage, and this is why a lot of times you can have high tier or a max G3 epic still taking out a relatively low tiered G4 uncommon pretty easily. So you can see, however, that the weapons are firing a lot more often. So if you look at the Kelvin, and this is the same for basically all G4 uncommons. So if you look at this, basically for all the G4 uncommons in round 2, they fire multiple shots. So for the Kelvin, in this case, it's got 8 shots that it can fire in round 2, whereas the first round it's pretty pitiful when it fires 2 rounds. So if you look at just the first round type of damage, it does not do very much damage. And this is one of the reasons why an officer like Harrison, which might be really useful on something with a big gun like a Saladin, back in the G3 world, is not going to be nearly as good on a Kelvin, just because it doesn't really do that much damage the first round. So just kind of keep that in mind. The ship ability here for all 3 ships is basically in regards to station defense, so we'll kind of ignore that for most of the PvP as we kind of delve into this. And then the cycle total here again it's 2, so it's not too bad. So it's 2, 2, 2. 2 rounds for 1 full cycle. So if we look at the first 3 rounds, it does the same damage, about 527,000. So that's kind of the Kelvin in a nutshell. If we look at the Valdor, so you see in the Valdor right off the bat, it's significantly bulkier. And this is actually kind of interesting because it's an Explorer, right? So we do expect the high shield health. And one of the things that you'll notice what Scopely has done is that they've tried to take the native faction strengths and applied it across all of their ships evenly. So what I mean by that is that, if you think about Federation is mostly about defense and shields, right? So they've actually given their ships, regardless of class, a bit higher shield health compared to other, let's say, interceptors, if there were other interceptors in the same realm. So you kind of see that where in terms of base shield health, actually the Kelvin actually has higher shield health than a Valdor, which is an Explorer, which you would expect. So on the flip side, though, the Valdor is also really strong because, it's about the same shield health as the Kelvin, yet it has a lot of hull health, and hull health is one of the factors that the Romulan faction is known for. So if you look at the aggregate here, it's got about 1.3 million in terms of shield and hull health, which makes the Valdora a very, very strong opponent. And it's also why the Valdora can actually take out some of the G4 rares if they're relatively low tier and the Valdora is crewed pretty well. By that I mean it can take out a Pilum pretty easily. So again, if we look at the firing patterns, it's got 4 shots in round 1. It's got 7 shots in round 2. So kind of the same trend here. A lot of shots in round 2, where most of the damage is. The only other difference is that in the fires in round 1, the damage that we're seeing here is actually about twice what you're seeing on a Kelvin. So if we look at the first 3 round aggregate, it's still, not too much greater than the Kelvin, but it's still, a little bit greater, so it's at about 600,000. But it wins so far significantly. It wins a lot more on the shield and hull health aggregates. And that's one of the reasons why the Kelvin's actually not a really good G4 uncommon ship. So with that said, let's take a look at the Katinga, which is the Klingon battleship at the G4 uncommon level. Again, shield, hull health. Remember, Klingons are kind of middle of the road for both shield and hull health, but it's a battleship, so it's got a bit more hull health. So actually a little bit more than the Valdor. So if you look at the aggregate here, it's not too bad. It's almost 1 million, so a little bit stronger than the Kelvin. Still quite a bit away from where the Valdor is. However, if you look at damage, and this kind of surprised me because I always assumed that battleships would have I guess more shield and hull health and less damage. Yet out of the 3 uncommon ships that we're looking at, even at a base here without any type of research, the battleship here, because it has, also it has a 3-round cycle here, but also, that kind of equates to what the first 3 rounds is. Anyway, if we look at the first 3 rounds, it has the highest damage out of all 3 of the ships. So 527, 600, and 672. So actually, if we look at just the data here by itself, and we take out other things like research and crews, and we hold those equal, one of the findings you can probably say is that out of all of the G4 uncommon ships, maybe the Katinga is probably going to be the best ship of the bunch. It's got, decent shield and hull health. And when crewed right, it can probably take out a Kelvin just because the Kelvin is actually pretty fragile if you look at the hull health numbers here. So you don't even need to get through all those shields with the right officers and with the right counter officers, namely Khan, on board. You can probably destroy it before it can destroy the Katinga. So a decent hull and shield health aggregate, and decent damage, actually quite decent damage in the first 3 rounds compared to some of the others. So this is actually surprising. So despite the fact that I dislike battleships because they're so slow, the Katinga is making a very strong case for it being one of the best G4 uncommon ships that you can get. So keep that in mind. And also just because I think a lot of people are getting outdoors to try to counter Kelvins, because Kelvins, from a rep standpoint, Federation is pretty easy to do. So a lot of people have Kelvins, and then following suit, a lot of people who are coming up now are getting outdoors. So maybe the third wave of folks who are kind of looking at G4 uncommons might consider Katinga in this case. So we looked at the uncommons. Let's look at the rares. So the rares here. So we're looking at the Federation first again. So this is the Newton. So the Newton, again, a lot more shield and hull health compared to the Kelvin, as you would expect. So 1.7 million. Definitely hull health, a lot of hull health because it's it's a battleship, and then the shield health is pretty significant. Just kind of carrying on in terms of that Federation tradition of having better shields. So again, one of the things you'll notice on the rares is that it's kind of flipped between rounds 1 and 2. So they do a lot of damage round 1, they don't do as much damage round 2. Or actually, they fire a lot of times round 1, and they don't fire as many times round 2. So from a damage standpoint, if we look at the Newton here, it's got a 2-round cycle. If we look at the first 3 rounds, it does a bit over 1 million damage. So 1.08 million damage. So that's pretty good. We're kind of going to ignore all the ship abilities again for the rares because they're basically in regards to PvE, so they don't really have any impact on PvP. Although the ship ability is actually really good for the rares, and it gets you a lot of utility because you spend most of your time grinding hostiles anyway. And I would say until you actually get a rare out, it's really hard to really effectively farm the broken ship components that you need to kind of upgrade your G4 ships. So I really like the rares, and I have 2 of them. I'm still continuing to upgrade them, even though I've got G5s out at the moment. So anyway, back to the thing at hand. We went over the Newton stats. Let's look at the Pilum. The Pilum is an interceptor, so it's Romulan. So it's got natively pretty high hull health. It's actually almost the same as the battleship, which is surprising. Unfortunately, it has really low shields, as would be expected on an interceptor. So right here, if we look at the firing pattern, you see it does a lot of shots, 7 shots in round 1 and only 3 shots in round 2. 2-round cycle total. And then if we look at the first 3 rounds, it's a bit over 1 million damage. So it's basically on par with what the Newton's doing. The only problem is the Newton's got a lot more aggregate on both shield and hull compared to the Pilum. So that's not really as good, I guess, for the Pilum from that perspective. So, and then we're looking at the Kuron. The Kuron, again, one of my favorite G4 ships. It is my favorite G4 ship, actually. So, it's got an aggregate of shield and hull health, so natively high shield health to begin with because it's an explorer. It has decent hull. It's not nearly as big as some of the others. So it's got 1.2 million, so the least of the bunch, but it's still kind of in contention with the Pilum. It's not really that far away, but if you look at the damage output, it does do a lot of damage. So, and that's one of the biggest things I found about the Corey in PvP is that it can do a lot of damage out front, and it's also one of the reasons why it does actually pretty good against some of the G4 epics, actually, which we'll look at pretty soon. So if you look at this, the first 3, it's got a 3-round cycle, so it's the same as the first 3 rounds. It's almost 1.2 million. So out of the gate, I would say that the Corey is actually going to do a lot more damage than the Pilum and the Newton. However, based on the data that is suggested here, I would say it's a toss-up between whether the Corey or the Newton are actually the best G4 rares for PvP. And to be honest, since the Newton's a battleship anyway, when I was doing my PvPs, I actually had a lot of trouble killing a well-crewed Newton with my Corey, and even with the Pilum, and the Pilum mostly because it probably wasn't, it wasn't hitting as hard, and also the aggregate is not really that strong. It's comparable to where the Corey is at. So, it's surprising to me in the aspect that based on these raw stats right here, that the Pilum could be argued to be the worst of the G4 rares. So that's just kind of FYI for you guys. I would probably choose between a Newton and a Corey. And just because everybody tells me I have a battleship bias, I would never choose a battleship. I chose a Corey. Had a lot of fun with it in my PvP days when I was in the G4 world, and it's still one of my favorite ships. So that's kind of my little spiel for you to get a Kuron. All right, let's look at the G4 epics. So here, the G4 epics get kind of crazy because the cycle is really long. All right, the cycles take 6 rounds for it to go through the entire thing, and each weapon fires at odd times, so it gets kind of confusing. So again, one of the things you'll note on the USS Enterprise, again, all energy weapons. So this type of setup really helps when you have TOS Kirk as captain. So a generic setup with TOS Kirk captain, TOS Uhura, and TOS Spock to kind of reduce, reduce critical hit damage. That would actually probably do really well on an Enterprise. So anyway, if we look at this, high shield and hull health, 3.7 million total aggregate, and then the first 3 rounds, it does okay damage, 1.4. And this is actually pretty crucial because if you compare to this base number and you looked at where we were coming in from the G4 rares, they're actually not that different. The only big difference is that despite it not doing that much more damage, it's got a heck of a lot more shield and hull health. So the aggregate here is much, much higher. And that is going to be one of the key differences for the epics, in addition to the ship abilities being geared towards PvP. So if we look at that, with the Enterprise, as long as it has morale, every time it gets hit, weapon damage gets increased by X%. So definitely, this is more of a nice to have, I'd say, from a PvP standpoint. Because it takes so much time to build. So everything that takes time to build, I would say, from a PvP standpoint, is that it's a nice to have. It's not going to really change anything that significantly. So the Tribune, this one is the Romulan battleship. So this used to be the best G4 epic out there before they made some changes to the Enterprise and the Hegh'ta. So here, and this is kind of one of the reasons why you'll see the aggregate here, even the hull health, is actually lower than what you're seeing on both the Enterprise and the Hegh'ta, and this is not normal, and this was made after the fact. It was a balancing change that Scopely made, and it was mostly in regards to Tribune's amazing ship ability. So as long as the opponent is burning the start of the round, so hint Giorgio, right? So make sure you have Giorgio captain or Giorgio on the bridge for the Tribune increases the number of shots of each weapon by X per round. So, you know, for the first few tiers, it's only one. I think at max, it's like either 4 or 5. So you would go from 2 shots. If you hit the burning, you're going to go from 2 shots to 3 shots at a lower tier. It can go crazy in terms of going from 2 shots up to 7 shots in round 1 once you have a max Tribune. So that's kind of the reason why it actually has lower shield and health health compared to the Enterprise and Hegh'ta, just because it was hitting so hard that it was really kind of imbalanced on that. But again, you know, same as the other G4 epics, it's got a 6-round, you know, cycle. So the cycle total, the total damage is 2.5 million. But if we focus on the first 3 rounds, it doesn't do that much, only 1 million. However, if you keep in mind that as long as you have the right Kuron and this ship ability is proccing, this number can go up significantly. So the Tribune can actually do a heck of a lot of damage, more than you would expect, okay? And then last but not least, the Hegh'ta, which is the Klingon Interceptor. Again, you know, 6-round total firing cycle. It starts hitting pretty hard by rounds 2 and 3. Right here, if you look at the aggregate, it's actually, it's not as high as the Enterprise, but it's pretty high. So decent shield health, decent hull health. I think from hull health, it's pretty much the same, and shield health, it's a little bit less than the Enterprise. So the aggregate, 3.1 million compared to 3.7 million on the Enterprise. However, it also has a really cool you know, ship ability. As long as the opponent has hull breach, every time the Hegh'ta hits, it increases critical hit chances by X%. So, you know, what this actually allows you to do is it kind of allows you to kind of get away with not having a con or an HE Wharf on this ship, because as soon as you have Lorca on there, as long as hull breach is being consistently procced, you'll naturally get to a really high critical hit chance pretty quickly. And in addition, if you look at the critical hit damage on the weapons, they're actually at a much higher base. So for weapons 1 and 2, which are these kinetic cannons, they're at 175% of base compared to 150% normal. And for weapons 3 and 4, these are at 200% critical hit damage compared to 150% normal. The only problem with this setup, again, and the problem kind of that's the same for all the epic Klingon ships, is the reliance on critical hits to do a whole lot of damage really quickly, and their ship ability, and like this one, it actually is tied to critical hit chances. It's just that it's really easily countered. So if you're being fought, if it's a one-on-one type of situation, the opponent has an explorer of any type, they can just throw on a TOS or Uhura captain type crew. And basically, a lot of the bonuses that you would get from your critical hits, you would get from your ship ability, all of that kind of goes away, and that's kind of the downside on it. But again, it would be a great ship to have, just because you would still be able to hit folks who maybe if they have multiple ships and they didn't have, you only have one TOS Uhura captain, TOS Uhura, so it could be used to hit some of the other ships, and it frees up because you don't need to have an HE Wharf or a con on this ship for it to kind of ramp up the critical hits pretty quickly. So definitely a really, really awesome ship to have, although still pretty easily counterable. And if we look at the first 3 rounds, it does about 1.4 million damage. So in regards to where everything's at, it's about on par with the Enterprise. I'd say it's probably worse than the Tribune, just remember, because of the Tribune's ship ability right here. So I'd say right now with all the G4 epics, I think they're probably pretty even, to be honest. Maybe it kind of favors the Hegh'ta a bit more, just because it kind of has a lot more flexibility with the ship ability as it is right now. But again, I wouldn't really recommend anybody to go out and get a G4 epic anymore. They just cost a lot of mats, they cost a lot of resources, and they cost a lot of faction credits, which would be better used for you to kind of save up to get that G5 uncommon, because a G5 uncommon would just basically destroy a G4 epic no matter what. So anyway, that's kind of it for the G4 wrap up. So, you know, if we want to summarize, I'd say the G4 epics are all pretty much the same. I'd say the Hegh'ta is probably my favorite right there. The G4 rare, it's a toss-up between the Corey and the Newton. Just because I don't like the speed on battleships, I'll go with the Corey. On the G4 uncommons, though, you know, it's not really that close. I'd probably go with the Katinga. I'd say the Katinga is probably my favorite ship here. And then the G3 epics, I think it's a pretty close tie between the Enterprise and the Augur. And if I was looking at just solely, you know, G3 epic versus G3 epic, I'm still going to choose the Augur. Definitely the D4 is going to be the worst in this case. And, you know, the worst here is going to be the Kelvin, which unfortunately a lot of people have just because Fed Rep is so easy to get in Tycho Core. And then the worst in the G4 rare category is probably going to be the Pilum. All right, now that said, let's just kind of look real quick at some of the officers that we had highlighted before. So Kuron, again, if you look at the captain ability, he has a 50% chance to automatically recharge all kinetic weapons on the first turn. What this actually means is that all the ships, all the weapons that fire in round 1 could be recharged, and they could, you know, fire again in round 2 immediately, and then their, you know, cooldowns start again. So that's kind of a little bit tricky in terms of how they're wording it. But basically, that's one of the things. The other thing I really like about him is his officer ability. Basically, on an interceptor, he can actually increase the impulse speed really quickly. So, you know, 25% at tier 1 is not bad. If you get a max, he's at 50%. So at 50%, this really allows you to kind of chase down a lot of smaller ships. So he's a really good officer to have, and much more attainable now that he's available out of the Ultra Recruit tokens. So in regards to firing pattern, you know, I was talking about it, but here's what it would look like. So this is just kind of an example of what it looks like on the D4. So the original is up here. You fire 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2 each round. With Kuron on the D4, you would fire 2, and then immediately if he procs, then the, you know, kinetic cannon recharges again, so you get an extra 2 shots in round 2, so you get 4 shots. However, you lose that in round 3, so you get no shots in round 3, so it goes, you know, 2, 4, 4, 4, like this every other round after round 2. So on a D4 type ship, I'd say Kuron's probably not a really good choice for you, just because you're losing out on quite a few rounds of hits. Here's Kuron on the Pilum, and I'd say, you know, this is where you're going to most often see him being used, just because the Pilum by nature fires a lot in round 1, and if you can, you know, immediately reset all that, that's 7 fires in round 1, 7 fires in round 2, that you can get 14 rounds off in round 2, in the first 2 rounds. So with that, you know, then everything gets reset down here, as you can see, so you don't have those 2 shots, so you only have 3 shots in round 3, and then you're back to 7 in round 4. So it's not too bad of an impact from perspective of the Pilum, so you can potentially see him, and you'll most often see Kuron being used on a Pilum, and I would say it's a pretty good use of him if you're going to use him for a specific purpose, which we'll talk about in a bit. And here's the firing chain on the Hegh'ta. So, you know, by the way, it only works on kinetic weapons, so, you know, this is kind of why we're only focusing on the interceptors for now. So, you know, on the Hegh'ta, I'd say it doesn't really give you that much, so, you know, you get 3 extra rounds in round 2, and that's it. Not that important on the Hegh'ta to me. I think there's a lot better captain choices for that ship. Here's my suggested use. You know, basically target smaller ships, which you can kill quickly. And to kind of go with that, I threw on kind of what I call the Gambler's Trio. Basically, you've got Kuron. So here, Kuron, you can get 14 rounds on a Pilum. So let's say on a Pilum, you can get 14 rounds on a Pilum with him when he procs. And then you also have Fat Mud. Fat Mud we'll see, you know, right after this, actually. So he has a chance when he's an officer to double your shots in round 1, so you can go from 7 to 14 in round 1, and then you can get a quick recharge and get 7 more in round 2. So in the first 2 rounds, you can potentially do about 21 shots. So if we remember back to the Excel spreadsheet on a Pilum, in the first 3 rounds and 7 shots, it does about 1 million damage. So 21 shots, then you can potentially do about 3 million damage. 2 million of which, if you have Harrison here and he's at a decent tier, you can go, you know, a lot of it can go directly to the hull. So definitely something good. It's not really going to work against a ship that's a similar class, or not similar class, similar type or tier. right? So if you're using a Pilum and you're trying to hit a Corey or a Newton, it's not really going to do that well, because even if you're doing 3 million damage or more than that, you don't have a type of counter officer here. So the basic mitigation on a ship with similar stats is going to be like 50%. So with 50% basic mitigation there, even if you're going to do 2 million damage in round one, 50% a million, that's going to go evaporate right away. And then depending on your tier of Harrison, only a portion of that goes to the hull. And then, even if Kuron procs and you're hitting round two, you're not going to get, through the shields in round two, because the shields get reinstated. So not very good for hitting ships that are in the same, class, I guess, as you. So no, like G4 rare versus G4 rare, but probably pretty good for hunting smaller ships. So like a G4 rare versus, let's say, a G3 rare or a G3 epic even. This would be a pretty good setup. And it's for people who kind of like to gamble, because you have a 50% chance for Kuron to proc, and depending on what your tier on Fat Mud is, and I don't recommend you use him until he's like tier 4 or so, which is like 50%. So until you get a higher tier on Fat Mud, I really don't recommend that you use him, because he starts out at 20%, right? So basically you have a lot of variables and variations on whether or not it can actually work, but it's still good. And a good example of this is during takeovers. Some people have a tactic where they call it a swarm, where basically it's all instant repair ships that are really quick and with fast crews. If you have a Kuron type captain here, remember he also with the officer ability, he also has increased impulse speed. So with this type of setup, you can instantly kill, you can catch a lot of those really small pesky swarm ships during takeovers and things like that. So just something to keep in mind for Kuron and how to use them. And Harry Mudd. So Harry Mudd, we kind of talked about. Not only does he actually have a really good captain ability, and this is something we'll have to talk about in a later video, one that I'm going to dedicate mainly to Harry Mudd. Basically, it's almost like God mode for the first 2 rounds if you can get him to proc. And if you go with full synergy, he has a really good chance of proccing. So anyway, so good captain ability, but the officer ability is the one we were just looking at. So at tier 1, I mean, don't use them. 20% chance, it's pretty low. I'd say by the time you get a tier 4, 50% chance is pretty good, and if you can max them 60% chance, of course, is even better than that. And then last but not least that I got pulled up is Chang, and his officer, or his ability, is actually pretty focused. We're going to focus mainly on the officer ability, because the captain ability is negligible. It's about delaying weapon fire, so it has a direct impact in terms of how the weapons are firing. It's different per weapon, and it's kind of different depending on where it procs. So it gets really complicated, and with that, we're gonna have to put it into a separate video on Chang as well. So at max tier is basically when I would suggest you use him, because then he has a 50% chance of proccing when there's hull breach, and it delays the weapon attack by 1 round. So it kind of pushes everything back by 1 round. And then, I've got, I'm actually getting material. I actually have material for a video just on this officer. And both with this officer and the previous officer, we'll kind of make a series here. And after that, we'll actually lead into, and it'll segue very nicely into an updated station defense video, because the one that I have right now, while good, is a little bit dated. And, just kind of a quick nod to the PvE application here on Armada crews. A lot of G3 ships, it's more about survivability. So basically, the crew that we suggest to our alliance mates right now is having Riker captain, because Armadas by nature, they take a long time, and Riker as captain, he's got a great ability of cumulative damage over time. And then Kirk and Spock here kind of helps keep forever shields up on the G3 ships. So any type of G3 Armada, this would be a great crew to have on the G3 ships targeting a G3 Armada. However, on the G4 ships, just because they're doing a lot more damage, you're hitting a lot more times. It's different. If you're looking at the Deep Space Armadas, which deal a lot more damage, deal more damage, but also has significantly more shield and hull health. On the G4 ships, we definitely suggest a completely different Armada crews, and it's more about getting critical hits as quickly as you can, while giving it a nod to mitigation, right? So you have 600% mitigation with the bonus from 6. In addition, 6 has a very good ability in regards to his officer ability. It's going to increase penetration. So here, you're going for more damage on the G4 ships and not just survivability. So you're balancing out survivability with damage with a nod, with actually a heavier emphasis on damage. And you can go test both of these crews on G4 ships on Deep Space Armadas, and I guarantee you'll find that the second one almost always, well, not almost always, I'll guarantee you that it will do better. We've run a lot of different tests with it, from G4 uncommons to G4 rares, up through the G5 ships. It's always been the same type of story. So in conclusion, you know, I think firing cycles have a lopsided impact on PvP performance. It's very important to get out of the gate quickly, so ships with more damage the first 3 rounds will generally perform better. In some cases, this is not the case, especially if you have a TOS or hard captain type crew. That kind of drags it out because, you know, basically getting critical hits in, so you'll survive longer. But still, from your perspective, from every other case, I'd say, you know, getting more damage out quicker in PvP is going to be very important. It's also one of the reasons why Saladins do so well in PvP, just because it has a really big gun that fires in round 1. Anyway, also, you know, different officer combos can improve beginning round damage output, although with a significant trade-off and not having things I said before, critical hits, breach, and counter officer build. So it may not be best suited for going against a ship that's basically in the same class as you, but it can be really good for you when you're hunting those smaller ships, as I had mentioned before. And lastly, you know, because damage output for G4 ships is so much greater compared to G3 ships, Armada crewing should be reconsidered. Now, with that, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. And if you have any comments, leave them below, and I'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.